Welcome to This Week in Virginia. We're delighted to have some distinguished guests who are going to help us on a very important subject today about where do you get your Virginia state government news. And I couldn't determine how to introduce the guest, a brief introduction, so I decided to do it alphabetically. And so I start with Bonnie Atwood, who's Tall Poppy's Consulting, Tom Brewster, professor at Bluefield College, Randy Dillard, Resolute Strategy Affairs, Megan Ryan, the Virginia Coalition for Open Government, Chris Saxman, President Virginia Free, Andrew Smith, Associate Director, Virginia Farm Bureau Federation. We may get more of your backgrounds in as we talk, and when it's pertinent, you all bring it out yourselves. But we're interested in having you inform our viewers as to where you get your state government news and where you would recommend that they get the news. So let me let me invite our former member of the House of Delegates, Chris Saxman, to start. And then you all jump right in, and I'll call on you if you haven't, but jump right into the conversation. So Chris, we know that you could carry the next 25 minutes, but take a few minutes and get it started, and then we'll get your colleagues to join in the conversation.
Well, thanks, David. I hope that's not my my reputation as being able to filibuster an entire 25-minute news segment on your show here. But thanks for having me again. I think the primary source of information I get around state government is from campaigns, candidates, incumbents, legislators, staff, the real people who are actually doing on the front lines. And that comes from relationships that I have and had throughout my time in Virginia government. But, when you go to a hard news, I have a daily subscription delivered, print edition, Richmond Times-Dispatch. They typically have the best coverage in the state. Washington Post also have a subscription there. They don't have as much coverage that we would like to have otherwise. The press corps has really been diminished over time. So you have to go to the sources of the information and what's going on directly, and hopefully I can aggregate that. And I push out a lot of that out myself. And then you got to go to digging deep and go to websites like VPAP, which is a great source of information. And then, of course, the Virginia General Assembly website has a good source of information as far as what's actually in the bills and what's going on in legislation.
Okay, thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, I was just going to agree with Chris. I'm kind of a mix between old school and new technology. When I first started lobbying years ago, we still had the Richmond Times-Dispatch and the Richmond News Leader. And so I'd read one in the morning and then go out on Main Street to the paper box and pick up mid-afternoon and catch up on things in the News Leader. And at that time, you really, like Chris said, word of mouth, you go to lunch on Main Street and you run into people and catch up on a lot then. But now we're getting things by the second through social media. And I'd have to echo again, Virginia Public Access. I think most of us probably get their morning email clipping service. When Tom Whipple started that through the Whipple Report years ago. But so many localities have lost their local paper, so we don't get that. But I'm still a mixture of old technology or paper and new technology. But and we all use social media, I'm sure, and the local news teams.
Okay, Megan, what would you jump in to say?
Well, I'd echo everything that Andrew has said and that Chris has said, and I would add to their lists Chris's newsletter, which I always enjoy because it's always lots of pop culture references from my generation. So I enjoy reading that. So I put out a daily newsletter for people who subscribe to us. And because of that, I end up reading local newspapers every morning, at least the headlines. So I visit probably 20 different local newspaper sites every morning, as well as the Washington Post, Washington Times, several different broadcast stations, the VPAP clips, of course, and I have a running battle with David Poole about who's going to scoop who on particular issues having to do with access. I'd like to say I'm winning. And I would say also then I have a Google alert I have a couple of Google alerts that use some keywords that I get every day and go through.
Okay, thanks. Tom Brewster, what do you do?
One of the things on Twitter is that they will curate your list. And one of the things that I have followed recently is, Virginia Politics, which puts you linked in with, some of the Virginia reporters, some of the political reporters around the state and their Twitter accounts, to where you can keep up within your Twitter timeline to what's happening and what's going on. And sometimes, I can be lazy, but I always click through. For example, if I go to someone's newsletter, like Chris's, who does an outstanding job with commentary, and as was said by Megan, infusing pop culture references in there, which I always find entertaining. It's always good to go to the hyperlinks within those blogs, within those newsletters, and actually go to the source where they're providing their analysis from. So also my particular interest is education. So it's nice to get particularly links to articles from David and his organization, and also the Virginia School Board Association, the Virginia Department of Education, which kind of keeps me connected with what's going on around the state and Virginia government with regards to public education.
Randy, let me make sure, get you in the mix of the conversation. What would you be adding to it?
Thank you, David. I follow, my first thing is the VPAP Virginia News Lead. I don't follow online newspapers. I want to read a newspaper. So I get up every morning and buy two newspapers, Times Dispatch and the Hampton Daily Press. But I also have Twitter. So I use Twitter, VPAP, their news feed, and two local newspapers on a regular basis. And I also get, I'm a broadband, I have broadband interests. So I'm part of the Broadband Breakfast feed, where that covers broadband issues nationally, where funding is being distributed, what projects are taking place. So I use various types of information. My brother was a news reporter, and one of the things he mentioned to me one time, he said, even a news reporter has a personal interest. It's hard to separate their personal beliefs related to how they do stories sometimes. So I have to sometimes read several different papers to get different spins on different things. So I always think about that when I see a news story, and who is the person doing the story and what's the agency. And I really enjoy the Virginia Mercury as well. I think they are a good newspaper for some reason. Nobody mentioned it today, right? But I like the Mercury.
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. What about you?
Well, I never thought that I would switch from paper to technology, but I have done that. And my main source is VPAP. After that would be the Mercury. After that would be the Times Dispatch online. And what I'm looking for is completeness, but also lack of bias. And I also read some papers that are not aimed at my demographic, such as the Free Press and Style Weekly, which give me more news, but I keep in mind that I'm not in their target audience, but I get a lot of stuff that way.
Okay, thanks. Angel, I want to get you involved. I know you had some questions that you wanted to ask.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Brewster, it might be a little more geared towards you, but what media outlets and what sources do you guys think that young students could use to get more information on Virginia politics besides social media?
Certainly. I think when it comes to politics, I often tell them to look at, particularly look at blogs, but look at both sides, look at different perspectives when considering one issue. But I always recommend, your statewide newspapers. I know, when I was principal, we always were required to have one statewide newspaper in the library, and it was usually the Roanoke Times. The Bristol was considered statewide then, but we also had the Richmond Times and such. If you want to stay connected with your state, it's important to have access to a newspaper that covers the state and covers state politics and has someone who's dedicated to thoroughly reporting on state politics.
Angel is a senior at VCU, graduating later this year. So before she would ask another question, let me see if others of you would want to chime in too. Do you do anything that's related to her generation? Do you have any suggestions for her generation?
Yeah, I'll jump in because I used to teach in high school, and my students still remember, this was back in the mid 90s, and my students still remember how much I emphasized current events when we were talking about American history, even back in the 17th and 16th centuries. And to make it relevant, I would draw out comparisons to current events, and it could be anywhere around the country, around the globe, frankly. But I think the most important thing for the younger generation, as they're becoming more engaged in politics, is to move away from sound bites, Twitter, social media, and get into more long-form journalism and understand investigative journalism better, and take your time and read more deeply. I don't think any of us are reading more deeply. I speak broadly. I'm sure some people on here are. I mean, I'm not. I don't read nearly as deeply as I used to or should. And I think that's one of the problems we have in our society from an information dissemination perspective. I think we need to read more deeply and broadly, and then try to have some intelligent conversations rather than try to prove something from a negative partisanship standpoint.
David, if I may, and Angel, I agree. So many people take the headlines and leave it at that, and that's their takeaway, and they have to go down deeper. And one thing that none of us have mentioned yet, because I think we're talking about more quick, at the moment news, but podcast. So many organizations and news outlets have podcasts, which I love, driving down the road or, driving in during the morning. And sometimes I've gotten caught during the General Assembly. The theme music from the latest podcast has come on during a committee meeting, but, groups like VACO and my own organization have used podcasts as a way to not just do the headlines, but get deeper in subjects, which I think is important, like Chris was saying, to dig down deeper in the subjects. And I think podcasts is something that the younger generation can buy into, because it's something that's dealing with media and not quite as long of event or investment in time that they might want to do.
If I can chime in talking to my son and my nephew, they are not traditional news watchers. And when I say traditional, CNN, MSNBC, they go into the non-commercial sector on the internet and follow different podcasts from some certain people. And I would just warn any young person that does that, as I tell my nephew and my son, you have to also be aware of the politics of the entity that's doing the podcast, trying to influence. Some of the young podcasters want sensationalism, but you also have to be reminded. And I said, I'm not suggesting that you not look at those podcasts, but look at a variance and try to determine and understand what that individual's politics, personal politics are. And again, in mentioning reporting, a reporter gives a slant, and sometimes that slant has personal things. So that's why you need to look at various podcasts, various news agencies, and newspaper online is great, but it's nothing like flapping a newspaper in the morning and being able to read it and reread it and keep it and go back on it again. I'm not against media, your newspapers online. I just get more enthralled with and have been with the newspaper. But I would say look at various entities of news to make sure that you get the balance, because it's easy to get a slant on a particular subject. So depending on the podcast you look at.
And we all find the reporters and outlets that we invest or trust in.
Right. I think Angel had another question that maybe relates to some of the pandemic COVID time that we're still experiencing. Angel?
Yes. Recently I was on Twitter and I saw that Northern put an executive order for, not executive order. He's implementing a new mandate to eliminate all the restrictions for COVID. How do you guys feel about all the limitations and the restrictions reducing?
And if I could add to her question while you're thinking about that, I keep hearing that there's a lot of confusion about it. And I, for one, have been scratched my head and said, what's the confusion? So what?
Yeah.
I'd like to lead off on that. I think, in my own personal preference, even though I've been vaccinated and maybe people I am in interacting with is vaccinated, you don't know who is and who's not. I still mask. That's my personal preference. They can say you don't have to wear a mask, but there are certain populations that are vulnerable, and there are certain people and organizations that don't mask, and there are certain people that are not vaccinated. So I don't want to risk it.
Oh, if I could jump in here. Angel, how I'm looking at it is, since my business is looking at open government, government record, access to records and meetings, the confusion that I'm seeing, David, is at the local government level, where people are going to be now meeting in person where they had previously been meeting online. And while that in itself isn't maybe quite as, not so confusing, I mean, that's pretty easy to figure out. We're going to be around, in the chambers instead of on Zoom like this. But for the public, it is confusing because some of these entities are moving to in-person, but they're eliminating what they've had for the past 15 months with it, which is to be able to give comments electronically. So we saw this in Stanton recently. We've seen it with several school districts. They're moving online. They eliminate this avenue. And there are a lot of people like Randy who may not be comfortable coming into the in-person setting or unable to come into the in-person setting right now. Maybe they aren't vaccinated and they shouldn't be there or what have you. But so that's where I'm seeing confusion, is how does the public participate in government once in the early days, at least, of the lifting of the mandate.
Yeah, if I can jump in here, I think a lot of the confusion stems from the fact that in the beginning, just a year ago, when we were going through all the different restrictions were placed on different sectors of the economy, and the restrictions were not uniform. And that was part of the confusion at the onset. And now everyone wants to take their mask off because they're vaccinated or have had COVID and have been vaccinated, and they're ready to get going. And they're not as they're not very patient, especially if you're driving on Interstate 95 going south these days. No one's patient on that road anymore. It's wide open, as an example. I mean, I think that's one of the cultural experiences that we're having right now, is that people want to get going, and they're not looking for another 35-page handout from the governor's office. They want to know yes or no. Do you have to wear the mask anymore? And I think that's part of the confusion, is because they have to unwind all those separate sectors because that is essentially state law, and violations thereof. Those businesses don't want to be held accountable or liable illegally, which has been the biggest bugaboo for most businesses. They don't want to be held liable for people getting the disease.
One of the things I've run into, David, is I participated in a yoga class last evening where the instructor said that you could take your mask off if you're vaccinated. I left mine on just because I've been conditioned for over a year now to wear the mask out in public. And it's a hard habit for me to break. It's something that I'm having to get comfortable with, before I go maskless. I've been conditioned for the past year to have a mask on. So it's going to be a difficult break for some people in, how we've been conditioned to wear a mask and be safe.
My last question is, I ran into a lot of people on my campus, on VCU campus, that feel like they shouldn't be vaccinated. How do you feel about that? And should the younger people do more research into the vaccinations? How do you feel?
I think this is out of
Well,
my pay
I'd
grade.
like to ask people, what reason do they give when they say they don't want to be vaccinated? Is it fear or what?
They're scared. Like, they said they want to wait to see how it affects other people, or like they just don't know what goes into the vaccine.
To those people, I would recommend they take a good class in statistics, because how they're perceiving it is not realistic. The risk benefit does not come out the way they're thinking. I mean, tell them you're worrying that a plane is going to fall on your head. It's more like that.
Yeah, I would, since we have 4 people in my house, in my family, who have that, they're in that age group. And the girls, we have 2 boys, 2 girls. The girls are very concerned about it because they don't know how it's going to affect their ability to have children. And it's a very real situation. And I think we're in a place that medically and culturally in our society, we've said, your body, your choice has been the construct for a number of decades. And at that, there's a certain, I get it at that age. It's easier for them to be less trustful of what's going on. And if they don't want to do it, fine with me. My wife, on the other hand, is close to my age. She's also had a traumatic brain injury and brain surgery. She's very concerned about inflammation that might come from a vaccine. And there's 3 different ones out there to choose from. So she's been very concerned about that, how it would affect her health. So there's a lot of people have a lot of different health issues that come into play that I think we have to give grace to, that they have to make up their own minds that's the best course of action for themselves and the public, especially as we get closer and closer to herd immunity. I'm getting vaccinated, for reasons pertaining to me. I've already had COVID, but with elderly people around in our family, I just think it's a responsible thing to do, and it's better for my health. It didn't go great for the first dose, but for younger people, I'm less inclined to make sure to have them do it. And I think we're going to run into a big problem if we mandate it in public schools and colleges going forward, if they have to have it before they come on campus.
Angel, I have a question for you. Your friends that don't want to get vaccinated, are they masking?
Yeah.
Okay.
They just don't want to take the vaccine. They're scared.
Which is understandable. I'm more concerned about the pandemic or the disease getting restarted. So if you don't vaccinate, if you steal a mask, I can't say too much about that. My concern is the ones that don't want to get vaccinated, nor do they want a mask.
Before we wrap up, got to give a shout out to Tom Whipple. Tom Whipple provided many of us the Whipple report for at least 15 years. He decided it was time to move on and do something else, and in his retirement. And now it's coming up on a 10-year anniversary that BPAP News has picked up the Whipple report. So that's about a quarter of a century of news aggregation. I was trying to say aggravation, but it was aggregation. One other source that I'd mentioned that no one is, I find one good article every 2 or 3 days is on VirginiaDogwood.com, another site that's out there. But the news is there, and I think that each of you's illustrated that through the many different sources, and encouraging people to dig deeper. If they can't dig deeper on every subject, to dig deeper on the subjects that they're going to be talking a lot about, arguing about, and disagreeing with their friends and neighbors and family. And I thank each of you, and each of you is a resource for people. And I hope they'll be in touch with you and follow up with you and say, I want to start getting your news that you have. So again, thank you one and all for being on This Week in Virginia. And I look forward to seeing you again, whether it's this way or whether it's without the mask, to see you face to face around Capitol Square, perhaps this summer when the General Assembly convenes physically in the capital of the Commonwealth. So thanks again, and best to each of you, and goodbye from This Week in Virginia.
Thank you.
Thank you all.